What would you do if the world had already decided you were finished? Not struggling, not slowing down. Finished. That is the exact moment Curtis Jackson, the man the world knows as 50 Cent, found himself standing in. And what he did next produced a masterclass in reinvention so precise, so psychologically fearless, that most people who read this book never fully understood what they were actually holding. Two questions will stay with you long after this video ends, and their answers will only fully land in the final section of this masterclass. Curtis Jackson rose from the streets of Queens, New York, declared bankruptcy in 2015, and then did something almost no one in entertainment history has managed to do. He rebuilt. Not just financially, but strategically, culturally, and psychologically. The result was a 4-year, $150 million contract with Starz, confirmed as the most lucrative deal in premium cable history at the time. Hustle harder, hustle smarter is his documented blueprint for exactly how that happened and why most people never reach it. Stay until the end, because inside this breakdown, there is a specific idea about perception and power that completely changes how ambitious people think about their public identity. And there's a quieter, more personal question woven through these chapters 1 about the fear you are still avoiding and what your version of going running looks like that will only fully land in the final section. If this kind of strategic intelligence gives you an edge, subscribe to the Book Vault now, because this channel exists for exactly one purpose: to give serious thinkers an unfair advantage through the most important ideas ever written. Finding your North Star. We begin this masterclass exactly where Curtis Jackson begins the book, with the single most dangerous enemy of every ambitious person alive, and he calls it fear. Jackson does not approach fear like a typical self-help writer. He does not tell you to eliminate it or pretend it does not exist. He tells you something far more uncomfortable, that most people have quietly organized their entire lives around avoiding whatever they are afraid of. They take the safe job, the safe relationship, the safe decision, and they call it wisdom. But Jackson calls it what it actually is: slow suffocation. Think about that for 1 second. Every choice you did not make, every room you did not walk into, every conversation you backed away from. How many of those were really about logic, or were they about fear wearing the costume of strategy? Jackson shares a moment from his own life that cuts deep. After being shot 9 times in 2000, he eventually laced up and went running in the neighborhood where it happened. He was afraid. He admits that clearly. But he also understood something most people never do. Getting comfortable with fear is not the same as overcoming it. Comfort with fear is just fear with a better disguise. This next realization is the exact moment the book splits into before and after for most readers. Jackson argues that fearlessness is not a personality trait you are born with. It is a skill you build through deliberate exposure to the things you want to run from. Every time you face what scares you, your confidence grows, and your fear shrinks proportionally. The person you are capable of becoming is always standing on the other side of the exact fear you are currently avoiding. And that question, what are you still avoiding, will follow you through every chapter of this breakdown. But knowing what to run toward demands something else, an internal engine that most people never take the time to build. Heart of a hustler. The second major idea Jackson introduces, and one that separates this book from every conventional motivation guide, is what he means when he talks about the heart of a hustler. He is not romanticizing criminal behavior. He is defining a character trait. Jackson argues that the hustle is a permanent internal engine, and its fuel is one thing only: genuine passion. Not passion for the outcome. Passion for the outcome. Without that internal motor, hard work eventually collapses into resentment, and that resentment is where most careers quietly go to die. And here is what most summaries skip entirely. Jackson draws a direct comparison in this chapter between his own hustle and the hustle of Steve Jobs at Apple, not because their industries are the same, but because the internal posture is identical. Jobs analyzed every product, every competitor, every detail with the ferocity of someone who could not turn the obsession off. Jackson describes that same quality in himself. He studied lyrics, he studied markets, he studied human behavior as if his life depended on it. Because at one point in his life, it literally did. That kind of total absorption is what separates people who grind from people who build. Ask yourself this, honestly. Are you working towards something you are genuinely obsessed with, or are you working towards something you think you should want? Because Jackson makes one thing painfully clear. The hustle only sustains itself when the passion underneath it is real. Borrowed ambition always runs out. The person chasing someone else's dream eventually stops running, but the person chasing what they were built for, they do not stop. They do not even experience it as work anymore. They experience it as identity. And that distinction is everything. But passion alone cannot sustain you if the people around you are quietly pulling you down. What comes next is the architecture of trust and what happens when you build it wrong. Constructing your crew. The third idea in the book addresses one of the most costly mistakes ambitious people make, and it is the mistake of building the wrong team. Jackson is direct. You are only as strong as the weakest person around you. This is not a motivational cliche. It is a structural fact about how organizations and personal networks actually function under pressure. One undisciplined person in your inner circle is not a minor inefficiency. They are a leak in the engine. And if you refuse to acknowledge that, the engine eventually stops. The Vault perspective on this is different from the standard leadership advice you have likely heard before. Jackson does not just tell you to find talented people. He tells you to study character obsessively, because talent without character will eventually turn against you. He writes about the people he trusted throughout his career, who later betrayed or undermined him, and he does not frame those experiences as bad luck. He frames them as failures of assessment. He did not see clearly enough, early enough, and that cost him. The most expensive mistakes in life are never about money. They're about the people you chose to believe in. Most people listening right now have at least one person in their inner circle they already know, deep down, is a withdrawal on their energy and not a deposit. You know who they are, you have known for a while, and the only reason they are still there is because removing them feels uncomfortable. But Jackson makes a quiet and brutal point. Every day you keep the wrong person close is a day you are choosing their comfort over your future. That is not loyalty, that is fear operating as generosity. Yet even the strongest crew cannot protect you if you don't know your own value. The next chapter reveals the negotiation principle that cost Jackson years before he finally learned it. Knowing your value. What comes next is the part of this book that most people never even reach, and it is where Jackson's street intelligence and corporate strategy fuse into something genuinely rare. He talks about knowing your value not as a matter of confidence or self-esteem, but as a matter of economic precision. You need to know what you are worth in the specific market you are operating in, and then you need to protect that number with patience and strategic discipline. He is explicit. Most people accept less than they deserve, not because they are weak, but because they are in too much of a hurry. Jackson shares the framework he used when negotiating to sign with Eminem's Shady Records. He had other offers. Some of them were financially competitive, but he understood that the right platform, the right association, the right leverage structure mattered far more than the fastest check. He waited. He assessed. He chose long-term positioning over short-term cash. That patience produced one of the most successful artist launches in music industry history. And Jackson's point is precise. Your value is not just what someone offers you today. It is what your positioning allows you to command tomorrow. This is where mainstream advice collapses. Most self-help frameworks tell you to negotiate aggressively and know your worth. Jackson tells you something more sophisticated. He says never take an offer personally because it is almost always a starting position, not a final judgment. The person offering you less than you deserve is not necessarily disrespecting you. They're doing their job. Your job is to know the difference between a lowball opening and a ceiling, and never confuse the two. That distinction alone is worth every minute of this video. But knowing your value is useless if you refuse to evolve when the market shifts. What Jackson discovered next is the single reason most successful people plateau and never break through. Evolve or die. This next idea from Jackson may be the one that stings the most, especially if you have already found some success in your chosen field. The chapter called Evolve or Die is built around a truth that almost every high achiever resists. What made you great yesterday can make you irrelevant tomorrow. Jackson watched this happen to artists around him who held on to a sound, a brand, or an identity long after the culture had moved on, and he nearly let it happen to himself. The willingness to shed what worked in the past is one of the rarest and most powerful skills in any competitive arena. Jackson points to his own pivot from music to television as the defining example. When his music career began facing resistance, he did not double down and force it. He paid attention to the signals. He studied the market shift. He moved into television production with the same hunger he had brought to rap, created power, built it into Starz' highest-rated show, and then leveraged that success into the $150 million deal confirmed publicly by the network. That is not luck. That is a calculated evolution executed with discipline while others were still arguing about their previous identity. And this is where human nature becomes dangerous. Most people do not evolve because evolution requires admitting that what they are currently doing is no longer enough. That admission feels like failure. It feels like giving up. But Jackson reframes it entirely. He argues that the ability to evolve is not a sign of weakness. It is the highest expression of the hustler's mindset. The person who cannot let go of yesterday's version of themselves has already begun their own quiet decline. The question is only when they will notice it. But evolution cannot happen in the dark. It requires a clear understanding of how the world sees you. The next chapter reveals the hidden tool that most ambitious people leave completely unmanaged: power of perception. We are now entering the chapter that this book's most sophisticated readers identify as its hidden crown jewel, and Jackson calls it the power of perception. The core argument here is that how the world sees you is not a passive result of who you are. It is an active strategy you must manage with the same intentionality you bring to every other part of your life. Jackson is not talking about being fake. He is talking about understanding that perception is a projection, and you have far more control over it than most people realize. Jackson illustrates this with a story about gaining entry to a high-end establishment before he was famous. A well-connected person saw his car and mistook him for an NBA player. That one moment of misperception opened a door that otherwise would have stayed closed. Jackson did not correct it. He walked through. He understood instinctively what took most people years to learn, that the world responds to the story your presence tells before you ever say a word. You can influence that story deliberately, through what you wear, where you appear, who you associate with, and how you carry yourself under pressure. Inside the vault, we call this the difference between reputation management and reality construction. Most people manage their reputation reactively. They respond to how others see them. Jackson argues you should construct your public reality proactively, decide what story you want your presence to tell, then engineer the details that make that story undeniable. This is not dishonesty. Your essence remains unchanged. But the way you frame it, project it, and protect it determines whether the world engages with your real self or perpetually underestimates it. Yet perception is only a tool. The real test is what you do when someone actively works against you. The next chapter explores a counterintuitive truth about enemies that most people misunderstand completely. If we can't be friends. This next idea from Jackson is one of the most misunderstood chapters in the entire book, and it sounds aggressive on the surface until you understand the psychological logic underneath it. Jackson's position on enemies is counterintuitive. If someone cannot be your friend, the next best thing is for them to be your motivated enemy. Why? Because enemies talk about you. They argue about you. They push other people to form opinions about you. And in a world where attention is the most valuable currency, passionate opposition generates almost as much visibility as passionate support. Jackson is precise about what he is not saying here. He is not recommending manufactured drama for its own sake. He is documenting a psychological dynamic he observed repeatedly throughout his career. When other artists attempted to dismantle him publicly, the resulting conversation drove attention toward his work, his brand, and his story. He understood that the truly dangerous position is not having enemies, it is being ignored. Indifference is the professional death that nobody warns you about. A rivalry, handled correctly, can be a career accelerator. The deeper layer most readers miss in this chapter is the emotional intelligence required to execute this without losing yourself to the conflict. Jackson makes a distinction between using competitive tension strategically and actually being consumed by hatred or bitterness. The moment you let an enemy genuinely destabilize your emotional state, they have won. You must remain the calmest person in every conflict. You must see the chessboard while everyone else sees the fight. That composure, that cold, strategic clarity in the middle of interpersonal warfare is what Jackson calls true power. But no rivalry, no enemy, no external conflict can hurt you as deeply as your own refusal to learn from what went wrong. The next chapter reveals the one discipline that turns your losses into your greatest strategic advantage: learning from your L's. Here is where the book reaches its most quietly transformative chapter, and you may not have expected the insight to land where it does. The chapter Jackson calls Learning from Your L's is not about resilience in the motivational poster sense. It is about something far more precise: the discipline of treating every loss as a data set rather than a verdict. Most people experience failure and immediately move to emotional interpretation. They ask, "What does this say about me?" Jackson argues that is the wrong question entirely. The right question is, what does the data tell me about the system I was operating inside? And late at night, when you put your phone down, a small voice comes, does it not? A voice that asks whether you have been honest about your own failures. whether you have actually studied them, or whether you buried them under forward momentum because the discomfort of examination felt like too much. Most people never audit their losses with the same rigor they apply to their wins, but Jackson is explicit. The losses contain more intelligence than the victories. A win can happen for a dozen reasons you do not control. A loss almost always points directly at something you can fix. This next idea is the reason this book has stayed on bestseller lists since its release. Jackson argues that once you master the discipline of extracting lessons from your losses without letting them define your identity, you become genuinely dangerous. Not dangerous in the destructive sense, dangerous in the competitive sense, because you are the person in every room who has already processed what everyone else is still running from. You have turned pain into precision. And precision, applied consistently, eventually becomes an advantage that no amount of raw talent can overcome. Yet even the ability to learn from losses can be poisoned by one thing: the quiet belief that you deserve something for your struggle. The final chapter exposes the trap that has quietly dismantled more promising careers than any external enemy ever could: the entitlement trap. We arrive now at what many readers describe as the most important chapter in the entire book, and Jackson calls it the entitlement trap. The principle here is stark. No one owes you anything. Not your industry, not your audience, not your network, not the universe. The moment you begin to believe that your past effort, your past success, or your past suffering entitles you to future reward, you have stepped into a psychological trap that will quietly dismantle everything you built. Jackson is blunt about this in a way that most authors would soften. He does not soften it. What happened next in his own story proves the point. After his bankruptcy, Jackson could have leaned on his legacy. He could have expected the industry to carry him based on what he had already given it. Instead, he treated his own comeback as if he were a new artist with zero entitlement to anyone's attention. He went back to building leverage, one project at a time, with the same hunger he had at 20 years old. That posture, that complete rejection of entitlement even after achieving massive success, is what separated his story from the many other artists who hit a wall and stayed there. Most people think this behavior is humility. In reality, it is survival intelligence. The person who carries entitlement into a competitive arena is always the last one to understand why they are falling behind. They spend their energy on resentment instead of adaptation. They focus on what they deserve rather than what they need to earn. Jackson's final point in this chapter closes something that has been building across every page of this book. Once you fully accept that you control your own journey and that nothing is owed to you, you stop waiting for doors to open. You build your own doors. And that shift in posture is worth more than any single strategy he teaches. At this point, the blueprint feels complete. Fear confronted, the crew built, your true value known, evolution embraced, entitlement rejected. But just when the lesson seems fully delivered, Jackson reveals the one thing that makes all of it sustainable, and it is not another tactic. It is the quiet, daily decision to take total ownership of your life even when no one is watching, even when no reward is coming. That commitment to radical ownership is what turns the hustler's mindset from a temporary edge into a permanent identity, and it is the single thread that stitches every other principle together into something that can last a lifetime. What comes next is where everything you have heard so far finally connects into a way of living you can begin today. Key lessons and insights. Fear is a skill problem, not a character problem. The first lesson this book teaches, and the one that reframes everything that follows, is that fear is not a reflection of who you are. It is a reflection of what you have not yet practiced facing. Jackson proves this across his own life repeatedly. He was afraid after being shot. He went running anyway, with a plan, with support, with preparation. Fear did not disappear. His relationship to it changed. That is the core mechanism. The goal is never fearlessness as an absence of fear. The goal is motion in the presence of fear. Practice consistently until the fear shrinks into something manageable. What this means practically for you is that every area of your life where you feel stuck deserves to be examined through this lens. Is the obstacle genuinely insurmountable, or have you simply never practiced confronting it? Jackson's framework says the only way to find out is exposure. Deliberate, prepared, supported exposure. Stop waiting to feel ready. Ready is what happens after you begin, never before. Remember the first question this masterclass opened with about what you would do if the world had decided you were finished. Jackson's answer is this: you would go running anyway. Your network is your architecture. The second lesson runs deeper than the standard advice to surround yourself with successful people. Jackson teaches that your crew is the actual structure inside which your ambitions either grow or collapse, not a support system. In architecture, every person in your inner circle is either expanding the ceiling of what is possible for you or quietly lowering it. Character matters more than capability because capable people with flawed character eventually use their capability against you. Build slowly. Build with precision. Choose depth over volume every single time. The practical application of this lesson is not comfortable. It requires you to look at your current circle with the same analytical clarity Jackson brought to every negotiation in his career. Ask, is this person making deposits into my growth or withdrawals? Are they challenging me or just validating me? Validation feels good in the moment and costs you everything over time. The people who make you genuinely better are almost never the most comfortable people to be around. Seek discomfort in your relationships. That friction is growth. Patience is a strategic weapon. The third lesson is one that the modern hustle culture almost never discusses honestly, and it is that patience, applied strategically, is one of the most lethal competitive advantages available to any ambitious person. Jackson waited for the right deal instead of the fastest deal. He studied the landscape instead of rushing to plant his flag. He signed with shady records over immediately lucrative offers because he understood that the right positioning multiplied his long-term value in ways no single check could match. Speed without positioning is just motion. Motion without direction burns energy without building momentum. The practical version of this lesson requires you to develop what Jackson effectively practices throughout this book: the ability to hold your most valuable offers off the table until the timing is right, not as passivity, as strategy. Every negotiation you rush because you are afraid the opportunity will disappear is a negotiation you entered from a position of scarcity, and people on the other side of the table always sense scarcity. It changes what they offer you. Patience signals confidence. Confidence signals value. Value is what gets you the number you actually deserve. Evolve before you are forced to. The fourth lesson is the one that has the longest half-life of anything in this book. Jackson teaches that evolution must be chosen proactively, before the market, the culture, or the industry forces it on you. The artists and entrepreneurs who wait until they are irrelevant to adapt have already lost the game. By the time external pressure forces a pivot, you have surrendered your leverage, your timing, and often your audience. The version of you that chooses to evolve at the height of your current success carries infinitely more power than the version that evolves out of desperation. If you leave with nothing else from this video, let it be this: the identity that got you here is not automatically the identity that takes you forward. Every 5 years, the serious players rebuild. They study what is shifting, they experiment while they still have resources, and they make their next move before anyone expects it. Jackson moved into television before the music industry pushed him out. That timing was everything. The move that looks like reinvention from the outside was actually careful preparation happening years before anyone could see it. Ownership over everything. The fifth lesson ties the entire book together, and it is the one that Jackson embeds in every chapter without always naming it directly. The lesson is total ownership, not just ownership of your business or your brand, but ownership of your narrative, your failures, your relationships, your time, and your outcomes. No excuses, no entitlement, no waiting for conditions to be fair before you begin. Jackson grew up with none of the structural advantages that most business literature assumes as a baseline, and he built a legacy that most people with every advantage never approach. The mechanism was radical personal ownership applied without exception. The 7-day action this lesson demands is specific. In the next 7 days, identify the single area of your life where you have been operating with the most entitlement, where you have been waiting for something external to change before you move. Write it down. Then write one concrete action you can take this week that does not require anything from anyone else. That action does not have to be large, it has to be yours. Because the moment you make an unconditional move in the direction of your own life, the psychology of the game shifts permanently in your favor. And that shift, that quiet ownership, is how you finally answer the quieter question we planted at the very start: the vault closing. This book is not really a business strategy guide. It is not a memoir. It is not a self-help system. What Curtis Jackson has written is a psychological survival manual for anyone who has ever been counted out, written off, or underestimated, which means this book was written for almost everyone listening right now. The intelligence inside it was not produced in a classroom or a boardroom. It was produced in the streets, in recording studios, in negotiating rooms, and in the quiet aftermath of personal collapse. And what his story proves, more than any single tactic, is that the person who has been counted out the most often has the deepest well of strength to draw from. That well is inside you too. The one action you can take within the next 7 days is this. Find the area of your life where you have been most afraid to move and make one decision, one concrete, irreversible decision in that direction. Not a plan, a decision. Because Jackson's entire book rests on a distinction between people who plan and people who move. Plans live in the future. Decisions live in the present. And the present is the only place where any real momentum has ever been built. That brings us to the second question this masterclass quietly planted at the start. What does your version of going running look like? That is your answer. If this breakdown gave you a single insight you will carry into your week, leave it in the comments below. This community is built by people who take ideas seriously and then go do something with them. That is the unfair advantage the Book Vault exists to create. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and become part of a community of thinkers who understand that the right knowledge, absorbed deeply and applied precisely, changes everything. We will see you inside the next vault.